Olaudah Equiano called it water full of worms, yet this sickening fluid was the difference between profit and death on the Middle Passage. Slave traders calculated every ounce, just 24 ounces a day, to keep over 10 million captives barely alive on voyages stretching up to 8 weeks, each body worth 20 to 50 pounds in ledgers, colder than the ocean itself. But the true story of how enslaved people got drinking water on slave ships is far more twisted than simple cruelty or neglect. And across barrels, blueprints, and desperate hands, survival played out drop by drop. Why did millions perish while others endured? The answers beneath the decks reveal a system built on numbers, rot, and control. Ledgers from the era of the Atlantic slave trade reveal a world in which human life was reduced to arithmetic. Every ship that left Liverpool or Nantes for the African coast carried not just shackles and trade goods, but detailed account books, profit tables with columns for bodies, ounces, and pounds sterling. The value assigned to each captive was chillingly precise. A healthy adult, once landed in the Americas, could bring between 20 and 50 pounds. For a ship carrying 400 people, the expected profit was calculated before the anchor even left the harbor. Water, on these voyages, was not simply a necessity. It was a line item, measured and rationed with the same cold logic as iron or tobacco. The daily water allowance per captive was set at 24 ounces, 2 small cups, barely enough to keep a person alive in the stifling darkness below deck. This figure appears again and again in ship manifests and provisioning records, not as a guideline for health, but as a survival minimum designed to protect the investment. The ledgers did not record thirst or suffering, but they did track loss. Every death at sea subtracted directly from the expected return. Blueprints of slave ships reveal the spatial logic of this calculus. Barrels of water, stacked alongside casks of salted beans and biscuit, took up precious room that could otherwise hold another body. The more barrels loaded, the fewer captives could be chained below. Ship owners and captains weighed these choices in pounds and shillings, not in lives. Trader manuals from the period spelled out the arithmetic. Calculate the minimum amount of water needed for the projected voyage, factor in the average death rate, and adjust cargo accordingly. The cost of an extra barrel was measured against the odds of delivering one more person alive to market. The economic logic extended to the labor itself. At African ports, enslaved people were forced to carry and load their own water supplies, hoisting heavy barrels that would later become their only source of life on the crossing. The records show no irony. The calculations continued, indifferent to the human hands that made them possible. Insurance policies, too, reflected this mindset. Underwriters in London and Bordeaux treated captives as insurable cargo, with policies that covered loss from death, but not from thirst or disease. The risk was always measured in monetary terms. Within these ledgers, the horror of the Middle Passage becomes a matter of margins. Each ounce of water rationed, each barrel stowed or left behind, was a decision made in pursuit of profit. The numbers tell a story of survival reduced to a formula, where the line between life and death was drawn by the ink of a merchant's pen. Slave ship blueprints reveal a world engineered for profit, where every square foot below deck was contested ground. Water barrels, made from white oak and sealed with tar, lined the lowest reaches of the hold. Each ship typically carried between 250 and 500 casks, stacked tightly to conserve space. But for every row of barrels included, there was a trade-off. Removing just one row could make room for 40 more bodies. The arithmetic was brutal. More water meant fewer captives, and fewer captives meant less profit. Shipowners and captains worked out these calculations in advance, using naval schematics and cargo plans to optimize their human cargo. Trader manuals from the period instructed captains to provision only the minimum water needed for the projected length of the voyage, factoring in expected death rates and the odds of reaching port with a full cargo. On the African coast, the work of loading these heavy barrels fell to the very people who would depend on them for survival. Otoba Kugoano remembered being forced to carry water casks up the gangplank, knowing each barrel would later be rationed out in ounces. The labor was backbreaking, and the irony went unremarked in ship records. The focus remained fixed on space and weight. A standard barrel held about 31 gallons, a puncheon 72, a butt over 100. Every cask took up space that could have been filled with another chained body, and every calculation reduced survival to a question of cubic feet. Blueprints from ships like the Brooks and Henrietta Marie show how water storage was squeezed into corners, under stairwells, and between decks. The barrels were lashed down to prevent shifting in storms, but their placement often exposed them to bilge water and the heat of the lower decks. The design left little room for error. If a barrel cracked or leaked, the loss was not just water, but profit. The risk of spoilage was weighed against the cost of carrying extra supplies. Manuals advised captains to keep just enough water for the planned journey, with a small margin for delays, but never enough to jeopardize the number of captives on board. The mathematics of space extended beyond the hold. Deck heights were reduced to maximize capacity, creating suffocating conditions below. Water barrels competed with food stores, shackles, and trade goods, each item measured for its impact on the bottom line. Insurance policies reflected these choices, covering the loss of human cargo, but not the consequences of running out of water. In this system, every decision favored more bodies over more barrels, more profit over more life. The architecture of the slave ship was a blueprint for survival calculated in inches and gallons, with water always just one variable in a deadly equation. Barrel making was a skilled trade, passed down through generations of coopers who shaped, bent, and sealed white oak staves to hold the ship's most precious liquid. Each stave, cut at least an inch thick, had to fit perfectly with its neighbors. Iron hoops squeezed the wood tight, and hot tar was brushed into every seam. Yet even the best craftsmanship could not outmatch the Atlantic. The wood, seasoned for strength, responded to the tropical sun and shifting seas by swelling and shrinking. As the ship crossed the equator, the heat forced the staves apart, opening hairline cracks that no amount of tar could truly seal. Water began to seep out, sometimes in slow drips, sometimes in sudden gushes after a barrel split under pressure. Iron hoops, exposed to salt spray and sweat, rusted quickly. The corrosion ate away at the metal, loosening their grip and allowing the barrels to flex with every swell. If a barrel rolled or shifted in a storm, the joints might slip just enough to start a leak. Some captains tried to reinforce the barrels with extra hoops or thicker tar, but these fixes rarely held for long. The tar itself, meant to keep water in, often melted in the heat, running down the sides of the barrel and leaving the wood exposed. Rainwater, bilge water, and even seawater found their way through these new gaps, contaminating the supply further. On the African coast, barrels were often assembled in haste from shooks, pre-cut staves and hoops, then filled with river water already thick with silt and life. The cooper's tools, dulled by salt and sand, could not always shape a perfect seal. Once loaded, the barrels were wedged into the lowest part of the hold, pressed against the hull, where the pounding of the waves and the weight of other cargo put constant stress on every joint. Even the soundest barrel, tested for leaks with a splash of water before sailing, could not withstand 6 weeks of motion, heat, and pressure. Mary Prince later remembered the bitter taste of water that had passed through tar and oak, a taste she could never forget. The barrels themselves became a symbol of the voyage, crafted with care, but never strong enough to hold back what was coming. Every leak meant less water for those below, and every crack set the clock ticking on spoilage. In the end, the technology of the day was simply not fit for the purpose demanded by the slave trade. Barrels designed for wine or oil could not keep water fresh and safe for hundreds of people packed below deck. The flaws were built into the very structure of the ship, and every drop lost or tainted was another reminder of the limits of human skill when pressed into the service of profit. Cloudiness crept into the water barrels within days of leaving the African coast. The first week brought a faint haze and a metallic tang as the fresh river water absorbed tannins from the oak and traces of tar from the seams. By the second week, the taste sharpened, bitter, sometimes with a hint of rot. The barrels, wedged deep in the hold and lashed against the hull, sat in a stew of heat and humidity. Air below deck often climbed past 30 degrees Celsius, turning every cask into a slow cooking vessel for whatever was inside. By the third week, a green film began to swirl in the buckets. Algae bloomed in the darkness, feeding on whatever sunlight filtered through the cracks and the nutrients carried from African rivers. Some barrels grew a layer of slime so thick it clung to the ladles. Iquiano remembered water that was full of worms, and ship surgeons noted the same. Thread-like creatures writhing in the rations, impossible to filter out with the cloths sometimes used by the crew. The water, once clear, now carried the stench of decay and a texture that stuck to the tongue. Week 4 marked a turning point. The water thickened, sometimes described as honey-like in consistency, heavy with suspended matter and crawling with visible life. Any attempt at purification, adding vinegar, squeezing in lime juice, or mixing in rum, only masked the taste for a moment. The underlying foulness remained. Some captains tried to stir the barrels or pour water from one cask to another, hoping to freshen the supply, but these efforts only spread the contamination further. The barrels themselves, sweating in the heat, began to leak, letting in brine from the bilge and salt from the ocean spray. Even the best sealed casks could not keep out the relentless intrusion of filth and salt. Disease followed the spoilage. By the end of the first month, waterborne parasites had seeded the holds with dysentery. Surgeons recorded the rapid spread of flux, bloody diarrhea that left the floors slick and the air unbreathable. The cycle was unbreakable. Contaminated water caused illness, illness demanded more water, and the only relief came from the very source of the sickness. Children suffered most, their bodies unable to withstand the double assault of dehydration and infection. Crew logs noted that by the 5th week, even the healthiest captives showed signs of weakness, sunken eyes, cracked lips, confusion, and despair. The final weeks brought desperation. Some captives refused their rations, unable to force down the thick, foul liquid. Others fought for the first dip of the bucket, hoping to avoid the worst of the sediment. In rare moments of rain, hands reached through the grates to catch a few drops, prized above all else. The barrels, once a symbol of survival, became markers of time, a slow countdown from cloudiness to worms, from bitterness to death. Every day, the water grew heavier, and the hope of relief faded with each ladle drawn from the bottom of the cask. At dawn, the deck bell signaled the beginning of a ritual that shaped every day aboard the slave ship. The crew assembled with buckets and dippers, their movements practiced and precise. Enslaved Africans, chained and exhausted, were marched up in groups of 10. Each group was given exactly 5 minutes, no more, no less, to receive their water rations. The logbooks recorded these timings with cold regularity: 5 a.m., 5 p.m., every day without fail. The water, ladled out by a crewman, was measured to the ounce. 8 ounces per person per session, poured into a small tin or wooden cup known as a pannikin. The bucket was passed down the line, each captive forced to drink quickly before time ran out. 5 minutes for 10 people meant only seconds for each to swallow what little they were given. If anyone hesitated, the guards barked orders or raised their whips. The threat was always present. Order must be maintained, and no one was allowed to take more than their share. The air during these ceremonies was thick with tension. The enslaved stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the bucket, counting the moments until their turn. The water itself was already turning cloudy, carrying the taste of oak and tar from the barrels below. Sometimes it smelled faintly of rot. Still, it was all that stood between life and death in the suffocating heat below deck. Disease moved easily through these shared buckets. Dysentery, spread by contaminated hands and lips, claimed more lives than violence or storms. Yet the system never changed. Each group was watched closely by a guard, who kept the pace brisk and the portions exact. Crew members, standing apart, drank from separate stores. Clearer, cooler water reserved for those who held the keys. Within the ranks of the enslaved, the rules of the rationing ritual reinforced a harsh hierarchy. Those who cooperated with the crew, translators, intermediaries, or those who helped keep order, could sometimes bargain for an extra dipper. Others, labeled as troublemakers, found their share cut or withheld entirely. The sick, especially those with visible signs of dysentery, were often passed over or given less, their desperate thirst ignored by the men with the dippers. The daily routine allowed no room for protest or delay. The bell marked the end of each session, and the guards herded the group back below deck, making way for the next 10. The ceremony repeated until every captive had been given their small portion, the entire process unfolding under the watchful eyes of armed men. In the ledgers, this was recorded as efficiency, a system for managing cargo. For those forced to wait in line, it was a daily reminder of power, control, and the thin line between survival and despair. Dysentery swept through the lower decks with unstoppable force. Surgeons recorded that, during some voyages, up to 70% of deaths came from disease, most of them from what they called the flux. This was not just a word for illness, but a death sentence brought on by water so fouled it became a poison. As the barrels turned thick with slime and the buckets passed from hand to hand, bodies weakened by dehydration began to fail. Children, their bodies smaller and more vulnerable, died in clusters. Surgeons' logs noted that young captives, unable to keep down the thickened water, lost half their number before the ship reached land. The cycle was relentless. Contaminated water caused dysentery. Dysentery demanded more water, and the only source was the same bucket that had started the sickness. Guards watched the suffering with practiced detachment, sometimes denying water to those whose bodies showed the worst signs of illness. Crew logs describe how the sick were given less, not more, as if withholding water could somehow slow the spread. Those who could still move sometimes fought for the first dip of the bucket, hoping to avoid the worst of the sediment that settled at the bottom. Despair turned to action when the suffering reached its peak. In 1732, as a violent storm battered the ship and rain hammered the deck, a group of captives saw a chance for life. Testimonies from the period describe how, as the crew scrambled to secure the sails, anonymous leaders among the enslaved broke from the routine. Hands reached through the grates, desperate to catch rainwater running down the planks. Some managed to fill makeshift cups, soaking their clothing in the downpour and wringing it out for a few precious drops. For a moment, the normal order dissolved. Guards, distracted by the storm, lost control as captives fought for the clean rainwater, risking punishment for a taste of what the barrels could not provide. Resistance flared in other forms too. There were attempts to sabotage the crew's supplies, stories of barrels found emptied or tainted, though records seldom name those responsible. Secret networks formed below deck, with those who had managed to catch extra water sharing it in whispers, risking beatings if discovered. Children, often overlooked by the crew, sometimes became messengers, passing mouthfuls of rainwater or the last drops from a hidden cup between shackled adults. The crew responded with violence and deprivation. Those suspected of organizing resistance or hoarding water were singled out, their rations cut or denied entirely. Yet the pattern repeated. As disease claimed more lives and as hope faded, the will to defy the system grew stronger. Even in the face of overwhelming control, the enslaved found ways to fight for survival, sometimes in open revolt, sometimes in small acts of sharing that kept one more person alive for another day. The storm that brought the 1732 revolt passed, but the memory of that struggle for rainwater lived on in testimonies and ship logs. Each act of defiance, whether a whispered warning or a desperate dash for a rain-soaked plank, became a quiet answer to the violence of the ship. In the eyes of the crew, these were disruptions to be punished. In the memories of survivors, they were moments when, even in the grip of fatal sickness, the enslaved refused to surrender their humanity. Inside London's Guildhall in 1783, the courtroom filled with the sound of legal arguments over what had happened aboard the British slave ship Zong. The ship's owners, Gregson and Company, demanded compensation from their insurers for the loss of 133 enslaved Africans, thrown overboard during the voyage from Africa to Jamaica. Captain Luke Collingwood claimed the killings were a matter of necessity. He insisted that the Zong had run dangerously low on water, and that sacrificing part of the cargo was the only way to save the rest. The numbers told a different story. When the Zong finally docked in Jamaica, the ship's log showed 420 gallons of water still on board, enough for days of rations. Rain had poured down during the killings, filling casks and making the captain's claims harder to justify. Yet the legal question before the court was not murder, but property. In the words of Solicitor General John Lee, this is a case of chattels or goods. It is really so. It is the case of throwing over goods. For to this purpose, and the purpose of insurance, they are goods and property. The owners valued each lost life at £30. Their claim rested on the maritime law of general average, the rule that allowed jettisoned cargo to be written off as a shared loss, provided it was sacrificed for the preservation of ship and remaining cargo. The court heard that, on November 29, 1781, 54 women and children were forced through the cabin windows into the sea. 2 days later, 42 men followed. Over the next week, 36 more were cast overboard. 10 jumped themselves, choosing the ocean over the hold. The crew's testimony described the water rationing and the decision to reduce numbers. The insurers countered with evidence of the rain and the remaining stores. Granville Sharp, the abolitionist, sat in the gallery. He had been alerted to the case by Olaudah Equiano, who brought him the news that the Zong's owners were seeking payment for lives lost at sea. Sharp pressed for murder charges, but the court refused. The trial was not about justice for the dead, but about whether the insurance company was liable for lost property. The judge instructed the jury to consider the enslaved Africans as cargo. In the end, the jury sided with the ship owners, agreeing that the insurers must pay for the jettisoned goods. The Zong case exposed the legal machinery that allowed mass killing to hide behind commercial logic. Water scarcity became the justification for murder, and the law measured loss in pounds, not lives. Sharp and Equiano challenged the verdict in the court of public opinion, publishing accounts that forced the British public to confront the horror behind the numbers. But in the records of Gregson versus Gilbert, the language of property prevailed. The verdict echoed through the slave trade, a warning that the law would protect profit, even at the cost of 133 souls. Barrel staves recovered from the wreck of the Henrietta Marie still bear traces of what they once held. When microbiologists examined wood samples from these sunken casks, they found DNA from bacteria known to cause dysentery, matching strains that still threaten public health today. The same pathogens that once swept through the lower decks of slave ships now appear in modern outbreaks, linking the past to water crises in places like Flint, Michigan, and Jackson, Mississippi. Analysis of the barrels revealed not just bacteria, but mineral residues and organic films, evidence of water that had turned foul long before ships reached the Americas. Isotope testing pinpointed river sources along the West African coast, confirming that many casks were filled with water already teeming with life. Ship logs and surgeon notes described water that grew cloudy within days, then thickened as algal blooms and worms multiplied in the stagnant heat. By the third week at sea, the water was often undrinkable, but rationing continued. The cycle of contamination and disease that began in those barrels echoes in the chronic water insecurity faced by millions today. Public health researchers have traced the same types of dysentery and waterborne parasites from 18th century shipwrecks to present-day outbreaks in under-resourced communities. The pattern is clear. When water is rationed, neglected, or left to stagnate, disease follows. Activists working on water justice issues point to this legacy, arguing that access to clean water remains a basic human right, not a privilege. The lessons from the Middle Passage are written in both bone and bacteria. Skeletons recovered from shipwrecks show signs of kidney damage and bone loss, markers of chronic dehydration that match medical findings in communities still battling unsafe water. The science confirms what survivor voices have always said: contaminated water kills, and the systems that allow it to happen are not relics of the past. The microbial fingerprints left in the wood of slave ship barrels now serve as silent witnesses, bridging centuries of struggle over the right to drink safely. For researchers and activists, these findings are not just historical curiosities. They are calls to action, reminders that the fight for clean water is unfinished business. On the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans were given just 24 ounces of water per day. Documents show this ration, barely enough to survive, was calculated for profit, not humanity. Ship blueprints and trader manuals reveal how barrels of water competed with bodies for space, while court records like Gregson versus Gilbert expose a legal system that treated people as cargo. Archaeologists have since confirmed water contamination and disease through barrel residue and DNA. Yet, many ship logs remain incomplete, and the daily decisions of captives, how they shared, resisted, or endured, are only partly known. Today, millions still lack safe water, and public health reports trace the legacy of water injustice from the past to the present. The names of the lost, recorded in ledgers and survivor testimony, remind us: denying water was not just a hardship, but a deliberate tool of control. This history, preserved in evidence and memory, still shapes the struggle for dignity and access around